Our episode begins in the center of the galaxy. Coruscant had been overturned in less than 48 hours. Before, it was the center of the Republic. The Senate was here, the Chancellor was here, the Jedi were here, and now they were all gone. The Sith Empire struck at the Battle of Geonosis, and then they returned to Coruscant, and they didn't stop. Of course, Coruscant was massive. There were 3 trillion beings that lived on the planet, and there were so many beings that were still alive, but many had been slaughtered. The Sith Empire was beginning to swarm the streets, execute the weak, and enslave the rest. The planet was going to become their first leg in conquering the galaxy. The swift strike made by the Sith Empire put the Separatists out of contention for power via the destruction of the Malevolence and the massive Separatist fleet supporting it. Not to mention the crippling loss of their leadership in General Grievous, Count Dooku, Asajj Ventress, and of course the mind behind all of it, Darth Sidious at the hands of the Sith. The Sith Lord of the era believed he could simply make friends with the Sith of the past and work his way into taking control, and that was far from the case. Though the bigger issue for the Sith at the moment was how they could handle their power structure. They were Sith after all, and being the fact that they were all Sith meant that they would simply try and vie for power between themselves. It was a simple recipe for absolute failure in the light of their greatest victory. The lines of the battlefront hadn't yet been drawn, and the Sith, after having claimed victory over the center of the galaxy, looked to expand their reach. There were many planets that could be very easily used for their growth, but there were also many planets that could become very troublesome for them in the future. The truth is, the Sith had no clue where the majority of the Republic forces went, especially those that belonged to the Jedi. Of course, the core was filled to the brim with militia forces, and the truth is, the core was mounting up a counter-assault, though the downsides of a loss here for the core would be nothing short of catastrophic, because the ships that were being mounted up weren't even Republic military-grade vessels. The largest ship in their combined fleet was a handful of Acclamator-class destroyers. These vessels were only meant to be troop carriers. The truth is the core could use them on the battlefront because they were fine support ships, especially if paired correctly with a ship of the line, like a Venator, but they were the ship of the line because of the circumstance, and that wasn't really too good. The Sith stood atop the ashes of the Jedi Temple, stumbling over the dead bodies of some of the most influential Jedi of this period. Some of the Sith started connecting the dots. At this point, they hadn't really gotten around to noticing that they were serving with Sith from the past and the present. For Sith in the middle, there were names that they were very familiar with, such as Revan and Malak, or never having heard of Vitiate, or simply never having heard of the ever-elusive Darth Bane. Darth Bane was the last in a line of Sith who ruled over an empire. The Sith Triumvirate was very well known, and Traya had to keep a tight leash on her students. Nihilus was ready to feast, and Sion was 5 seconds away from losing his mind every 2 seconds because, well, he's a psycho. The issue was the Sith Masters, and the reason being is after the Jedi were slaughtered, the only challenge to their individual rise to power was each other. Immediately, Malgus, Vitiate, Traya, and Revan, to name a few, got in each other's faces about who would take control. The truth is, this conversation didn't take too long to get very heated. Malgus had a very short temper as an individual, while Darth Traya was about to release her ace in a hole, that being Nihilus. The Sith stood on the edge as a Sith emerged from the shadows, demanding the Sith to simmer down. His name was Darth Bane, and as far as any of the Sith were concerned, he was a marauder. Darth Bane, while being the Sith to establish the rule of 2, was the last in the line of Sith Lords that led armies into the battlefront. Darth Bane created the rule of 2 because he watched the Sith Order be destroyed, and he believed the best path to longevity for the Sith was the rule of 2. Considering the Sith had survived for nearly 900 years after his death, it seemed to work pretty well in his favor. Bane stood before the Sith he knew so much about. Before he could speak, Malgus ignited his lightsaber, demanding to know who he was and why he dare speak to any of them. Bane didn't flinch. He looked at Malgus and told him that he wasn't afraid. He was here to ensure that they didn't fail. This obviously wasn't the right choice of words because Sion from the other corner of the room ignited his lightsaber and lunged forward before his master waved her hand in front of him. Darth Bane told the collective Sith that he was a sole survivor of a terrible battle that ended the legacy of the Sith Empire. He ensured the longevity of the Sith by creating the rule of 2. Malak had enough of this, and he wrapped his arm around Bane's neck, igniting his lightsaber, holding it next to Bane's head. Revan told Malak to knock it off. He was curious in what Bane had to say. Bane shoved Malak back and expressed that if all of them wanted to be masters of the Sith Order, then they needed to collaborate. They would all fail their mandate to rule the galaxy if they fought with each other. Malgus sheathed his lightsaber as he looked over at the other Sith. Truthfully, Malgus believed he should be the rightful leader of the Sith, but he saw reason with this line of thought. Darth Bane continued telling the Sith that it would be best for them to collaboratively take over the galaxy and then divide the galaxy up for each other, in which the Sith would assume complete control over their sector of the galaxy, while also having no real reason to compete with each other. The downside to this, though, is that after they assumed control over the galaxy, what would happen? Of course, Bane hadn't gotten around to that yet, because at the moment the most important thing to do was ensure that the Sith didn't eat each other alive. It would best be sustainable as an idea for the time being, considering that most of the Sith present seemed to be on board with it. While there was a lower level Sith like assassins and marauders with their own opinions, no one really cared about what the grunts had to say regarding the strategy. It was decided that the different Sith Lords would scour the galaxy and start taking it over. As the Lords discussed strategy, one of the marauders brought forward a map of the galaxy. Not much had been really changed. For some of the Sith, there were new planets and new sectors of the galaxy that had come to life. Their intergalactic playground of terror got larger, and all they had to do was accidentally end up in the future. The map was spread out. Revan, for the few of those around before him, was the master strategist of his time. He would be able to concoct a plan and turn the tides in the favor of the Sith, as if they weren't already in majority of favor. Moments in the analyzing of the strategy, a communication came down from Vaylin, Lord Vitiate's daughter, as she informed the Sith that there was a Republic force present. The unified core worlds mounted up an assault. All the core worlds other than Biss, Corellia, and Kuat, the 3 planets that were a part of a deep core coalition, decided against sending their troops because they realized that the most important offense in this situation was actual defense. Over Coruscant, in between the debris of thousands of vessels, both Republic, Separatist, and Sith, a new battle was waged. The Sith fleet was essentially decimated at this point. They had fought the Separatists head-on during the initial battle of Coruscant, and scrapped their way out of the situation by using a weapon inside of the ancient Sith temple located beneath the former Jedi temple. The militia fleets that arrived over Coruscant were weak. Sure, they weren't as weak as the Sith fleet, but the ship of the line was an acclimator, and even the basic Sith warship had enough weaponry to make damage of that support ship and the acclimator itself. The battle jumped into chaos, but the truth is the core world militias weren't exactly great at fighting. They were simply safe jobs for people of each of the respective planets, because there was no conflict in the galaxy, and there was no need for real war, and so their training wasn't exactly critical to their jobs. When they were deployed for combat, they entered combat with a force that had spent decades preparing for war. Of course, it had been centuries since the armies of the past had been here, but for them, the transition from past to present felt like seconds. All their training and hard work that they did in the past carried over, and they were fighting a society that hadn't seen a real war since the time before the era of the High Republic. This army of militiamen were too weak for their own good, and within the first 2 hours of combat, their fleet was beginning to crumble. The only thing is, it wasn't crumbling because of the Sith weaponry on the ground. It was actually because of the strategy implemented by Lord Revan. Nihilus would have wanted to use the Sith temple, but the truth is, the biggest vessel in the Republic militia fleet was too small for the super weapon to be able to hit from the ground, so the entire battle had to be decided through superior strategy, which is something that Lord Revan was able to implement into the troops as the battle began. For Revan, this was a perfect power play, especially against the egotistical minds of the Sith Lords that followed him. It was enough to remind them of why he was so good at what he did, though it would still make the other Sith Lords seem as a threat to their greater power. The Republic militia fleet would have a single vessel return to their home worlds, and so from there, Revan would spend time forcing their laborers of the Sith and newly formed slave population from Coruscant to work on rebuilding the destroyed and damaged vessels of the Sith. While at the same time, the Sith would begin to disperse. Some of the Sith would take single vessels, some of the Sith would take an invasion fleet, and others would simply take a transport of ships by themselves with a couple of troops. But it was enough to spread out rapidly across the galaxy. Darth Bane and Lord Revan stayed present on Coruscant because they were the two Sith Lords from different eras that could actually see eye to eye with each other at the moment without trying to kill each other every 2 seconds. Darth Malak went into leading a small invasion force down onto Korlog and wiping the floor with the local population, while at the same time conquering a new Sith world for the Sith. The Sith Triumvirate, featuring Darth Traya, Sion, and Nihilus, would strike directly at north of Coruscant and swoop down onto a Naxos like the Angels of Death they were. They wouldn't travel with an army, they would simply go by themselves and wreak carnage across the entire planet by themselves. Lord Vitiate would send his Children of Death to Bilbringi, while he led an invasion force to Dalia. Arkan, Thexan, and Valen would all work together as siblings to bring a downfall to the people of Bilbringi, while their father's army made short work of any defenses over Dalia. The path to Bilbringi and Dalia would be set in motion by Lord Malgus, who would recreate his infamous invasion of Alderaan, except this time he wouldn't struggle. He would swoop in and destroy everything in his path. The only Sith to fail in their attempts to reach outwards would be the ancient Sith Lord, Exar Kun, who lost a majority of his forces in an attack on Biss. It was a brilliant defense made by the trio of the core, those being Biss, Corellia, and Kuat. The three planets now knew the importance of their infrastructure for any real military space force, and so they kept themselves defended. It worked brilliantly because in the days after the successful Battle of Biss, all the planets in the core surrounding the three planets would be taken over by the Sith without any struggle, some of them being Halmora, Avarlim, Bestine, Nemodia, and Abrogado Ray. These planets would be torn to pieces, and while yes, the stance of the Sith was absolute chaos, they began to slow down how much damage they did per invasion, because while their lust for victory was overbearing, their inability to capitalize off of global populations began to cost them. If the Sith could conquer planets, they could either have willing forces to fight for them, or they could have slave labor, and either of which was good for the better cause of themselves, and it was much better than just simply burning a planet to the ground and killing everyone. So shortly after the scourge of the deep core, the planets of the core and the northern expanded regions would quickly be taken over by the Sith. Populations of each of these respective areas would be forced to obey the rule of the Sith, and as the Sith began to expand further out into this direction, the better the communication between Sith Lords became. While there were those, even marauders and assassins, who went out of their way to do their own things, there were Sith Lords who began to jolt away from the status quo. They began to see opportunity in the air, especially as the Sith controlled everything in the northern half of the galaxy within a month and a half of the Battle of Coruscant. Exar Kun was one of the notable Sith who started to move within the ranks of the Sith. Of course, he was one of the older, more recognizable Sith in the Sith Empire, but he felt embarrassed by his defeat over Biss. While no other Sith could break through Biss, Corellia, or Kuat, he felt as if all eyes were on him, because he was one of the original reason every other Sith had to try and take the fight to the Jedi, because he was one of the original failures. Sure, that was a pessimistic way to look at the loss of Biss, but his inability to capitalize and find victory against the Republic in his age, it didn't really make a difference for him. Exar Kun was an odd man out because he was finding it difficult to find some appreciation from the other Sith Lords from within the ranks of the Sith Empire. This was also because the other Sith had been so victorious in their campaigns in the northern expanded regions. All these new territories for the Sith were perfectly placed so that they could have field day without interference from the Jedi. Well, the month after the Battle of Coruscant saw a horrific loss for the Republic and the galaxy, the Jedi and the clones were making strategy of the territory they had at their disposal. The difficulties for the Republic were dealing with the Separatists, because at the moment the Separatists weren't exactly interested in forming bonds with the Republic. Most of it was out of arrogance of the respective Separatist leaders, who didn't fall under the central authority, and other part of it was the fact of the amount of droids the Separatists had at their disposal. Because the truth is, the Separatists assumed that the Sith would just do their job for them, and then they can unite forces with them. Sure, they destroyed the Malevolence at the Battle of Coruscant, but the battle was hectic, so they gave them a pass. The Republic was there too, and it was a very tense moment for all sides. This was the only reason the Separatists assumed they could just side with the Sith. That was until they started losing their own territory, Glossographic map, to the Sith. Because even though the Separatists had droid armies, they were facing down armies of extremely well-trained soldiers, being led by warriors that held lightsabers that were trained to be warriors for the Sith. This wasn't trying to fight the Jedi who held peace for over a millennia. No, this was fighting a formidable force that was growing stronger by the day. There were new recruits to the lines of the Sith. Their slave labor was paying off at the shipyards around Coruscant, and they were outfitting their fleets with age-appropriate gear. All the while, the Separatists decided that it would be a better idea to sit back and watch. The Separatists were the victim of their own ignorance, and that would cost them, as the Sith Empire began slowly to encroach on their territory in the Mid-Rim. This was where the Sith Empire's success began to slow down. Their success was still top-notch, they just ran into a mass amount of droids. which began massive campaigns and elongated sieges that would take superior strategy over superior numbers to come out victorious on. The Republic, on the other hand, decided to fall back and call itself a little perimeter in the Outer Rim. With Kuat, Corellia, and Biss still operational, there was a solid chance for redemption for the Republic, especially in terms of holding their own in the most important front of any battle, the space combat. The Republic forces also added an additional cloning facility, though this wasn't at the request of the Republic, rather it was a safe move made by Lama Su, the Prime Minister of Kamino. The Kaminoans had multiple facilities a while back, and they had abandoned them for cost effectiveness, but considering the life and death of the galaxy were on the line, they might as well get to work on creating new clones. Though the one thing is that these clones would be much more expendable than any other legion of clone already created. The reason being is that these clones would have hyper-focused age acceleration, so when the Kaminoans arrived at their former colony on the world Boravio, they would begin the cloning process with a sample of the Jango-fed Geno, and the acceleration was enhanced at 10 years to every 1 year. So on the bright side, if the Republic survived for 2 years, they'd have a new batch of clones in 2 years. On the downside, those clones, if they survived, wouldn't last more than 4 years of serving the military. Though there was one important detail about this batch of clones. They wouldn't have inhibitor chips, because the inhibitor chip required them time to naturally develop inside of the brain. And because these clones would age 20 years in 2 years, the brains wouldn't be able to accept the inhibitor chip without destroying the brain in the process. The only issue was delegating the rest of the clones based in Topoka City on how they wanted them to be grown, whether it be super acceleration or traditional doubled acceleration. Lama Su and Nala Se were in intense debate about this, but the truth is, the hardest part about setting all of it up were the supply lines across the galaxy. Most of the supplies came from other planets, and with half of those planets being taken over, the Kaminoans needed a means to which they could get materials to supply their armies. See, it wasn't the gear itself. The aerosmiths on Kamino built the armor and designed all the armor for Generation 1 clones. The issue with the other clones is that their hyper-accelerated growth would cause more defects to come out of the cloning process, but it was a risk they needed to make, and that was made abundantly clear to them by Grandmaster Mace Windu. The Mace and the Republic realized they had a perfect little perimeter to which they could be protected. It was set up immediately upon their arrival to Ahch-To, and it was meant to ensure the longevity of the Republic and of the Jedi. Though the Jedi made an extreme effort to hide Ahch-To from the rest of the galaxy, only top clone troopers knew about it and its location. But with the Sith ramping up their scourge of the galaxy, Mace Windu began dispatching Jedi to different frontline worlds to try and hold any positions possible. The Separatists were the larger threat in the Outer Rim and in the Mid-Rim though, surprisingly. Because without Dooku or Palpatine, the Separatists were using their full arsenal to its full capabilities. Every single droid foundry was pumping out battle droids and sending them to the front lines. Every single droid shipyard was releasing more support ships and ships of the line to the front lines so that every defense fleet could be as powerful as the next. Coincidentally, the Separatists were boxing the Republic into a smaller region of the Mid-Rim, which meant that the Separatists were taking a lot of the early war losses because they were on the frontline worlds. Of course, it was perfectly fine because with the Separatists and the amount of forces they could pump out, thanks to Geonosis and the other critical worlds like Hypori, they were releasing millions of droids monthly, and that wouldn't really be a problem for them. Though on a side note, this meant that the Separatists were beginning to see an ability to crash down hard on the Republic, because the Republic was weak, though the only reason they didn't was because of the leader military of operations, Admiral Trench. While yes, Trench saw the Republic as a threat, he realized the importance of utilizing the Republic until they were no longer needed, which for Trench meant he used all of his outlining worlds between the Sith Empire and the Republic as neutral sites. Yes, there were fleets present, but nothing large enough that would cost the Separatists that much. Admiral Trench was leaving these places weak so that the Sith army could pile in and try and attack the Republic for the Separatists. Once they did, they could swoop in around the Sith Empire and cut off their supply lines and launch a counter-strike from both sides. It would allow the Republic to take some of the fight on while also disposing the Republic and the Sith Empire. In his mind, it was brilliant. To an extent, it also may have been brilliant. On the other hand, between the lines of Galactic War Map, there was a coalition of planets that, before the Battle of Geonosis or even the Battle of Coruscant, had signed peace treaties. For leaders like Duchess Satine of Mandalore, this was a no-brainer idea, mostly because she, looking in on the fragility of the Republic, could see that Palpatine was pushing for a war, and because Satine was neutral, she had many interactions with the Countess Sereno. But when the Sith army came around the corner, she hadn't expected both Palpatine and Dooku, who in her mind were on the opposing sides of combat, to be completely eradicated. Though with the neutral system coalition, Satine and her constituents saw an immediate issue. In a traditional war, the neutral systems wouldn't be touched, having signed both treaties with the Republic and the Separatists that they were out of the war, and remained peaceful. But with a foe like the Separatists and the Sith Empire vying for more power in the galaxy by taking over planets that were even neutral, she realized that being neutral didn't really make them safe. Especially with the Separatists taking over Ryloth within the first month, and the Sith Empire taking over notable worlds such as Mon Calamari, Bilbringi, Eridonia, Conquered Dawn, and Ithor within the first month. Mandalore sat in an unsafe part of the galaxy, and it was up to Duchess Satine to maneuver her way out of this. Of course, she knew that there was one way to do it, but it would have to undo everything the neutral system stood for, and everything her family had worked towards since the era of chaos ended on Mandalore. It was a tough moral decision for the Duchess because it didn't just involve her homeworld, it involved 1,000 of still non-conquered systems across the galaxy that hadn't yet faced down the Separatists or the Sith Empire. In a war, there are heroes and villains, and within the first month of combat, the lines had been drawn. It was up to the Republic and the heroes of its war effort to decide how they should tackle the incursion of the Separatists, and the Sith Empire especially, with both of which breathing down the necks of the neutral system coalition and that of the Republic as well. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is part 2 of our series. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jonathan Pimp Daddy Bane, Darth Cheesy, Apollo Mad Manic Studios, Anakin 003, Darth Revan, and Tiger Boy for supporting the channel. If you want to see what if, let me know below. Over to Constant Crossovers. Check out everything. The schedule is right here if you want to know what episode comes next. Choices is coming next. Remember, this is a continuous series. All the episodes do not show all the information. All the episodes will have new information each episode. So I am not going to talk about anything until episode 6 for all the information of these arcs builds too. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.